are you doing today? I hope you have had a good week, or at least as well as it can be. Sometimes weeks suck, I know that. But right now, we are here together for some good story time. So we're just going to let the rest of the week go, and we're just going to concentrate on the here and now, enjoy a good story or two or three, and just let it go. It's another night. It's getting a little chillier still at night, so I hope you have your favorite beverage. I've gone with something blackberry because we're hoping for that spring, right? A good blackberry lemonade. Nice flavor spring. Right? That doesn't perk you up, hoping for the best. But maybe you go and have your favorite drink. A nice warm tea, coffee, if that's how you do it. Hot toddy, good hot cocoa, or even at least some water. So you gotta remember to stay hydrated. It's easy to forget to not stay hydrated, especially when it's not too cold or not too hot, and you think you're right at that perfect temperature with your body, and you still need those nutrients and that water to keep yourself going. But, like I said, go grab that favorite beverage, and we're going to settle in, and we're going to have some stories. We have a couple different stories, just some fun ones, nothing in particular. Looking towards spring, or right in that time, getting a little cabin fever, a little bit of mischief making, a little bit of fairy tales, right? We got some jolly making coming up with some of the Saints' days that are coming up. We are just done with Mardi Gras. Yeah, we're right in that mood of a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and that's what we're going to do today. Like, we have the Yellow Fairy book, and we have some others, so I'm definitely excited about that. And like we always do, we're just going to have some fun and enjoy the time with each other. Sounds like a plan, doesn't it? So, I hope you are all ready. Go grab your drink, and then let's settle in. Just so you know, as with most Fairytale Fridays, if you do redeem any of the theater tickets, or if you're a subscriber and such, and you put in any of the requests, I will get to them. I will not be ignoring them, but I might not get to them until I'm done with a chapter or at the end of a story, so we don't lose the flow of the story. But I will get to them. I do see them. And also, if you pop in, I will say hi. Don't worry about it. I do acknowledge what you write in chat. Just, it might need to wait a minute or two, so we don't mess up the story, because sometimes the chat dialogue doesn't always go along with the storyline at the time. But I do see them, and I do hope you have fun with them. Whew. So, I think we are going to get in to some of our stories. We have a couple of our favorite editors here. So fun. So fun. Hmm. Are we ready to settle it? Oh, I hope so. The first stories we're going to be taking from is from the Gray Fairy book by various authors. It was put together by Andrew Lang. He's one we have seen before on the stream. His series of books was known as the colored fairy books: the gray, the yellow, the lilac, the red, the blue. So that's how he grouped them together. Sometimes they're more to a certain aspect, and sometimes it's just togetherness, because he decided to put them together with some commonality. And I know these ones come from like Lithuania, Africa, Germany, Greece, France. So they are from around the world, which is why we like some of Lang's stories, because at the time, at the early turn of the 20th century, end of the 19th, he was pressing to introduce children in the Western world, in the UK, in the United States, to stories from different cultures, different lands, really pushing, sometimes switching it up, but to make it more understandable and adaptable to them, so they learn the ideas of the stories. Which is very, very right up the alley for what we like to do here. Yes, this one was 1900. And like I said, it is various authors. Okay. Shall we begin? Which should we start with? Hmm? I've read that one. Ready? We have the goat-faced girl. That's a title, isn't it? So let's sit back, relax, and we'll hear the tale of the goat-faced girl from the Gray Fairy book. There was once upon a time a peasant called Massanello, who had 12 daughters. They were exactly like the steps of a staircase, for there was just a year between each sister. It was all the poor man could do to bring up such a large family, and in order to provide food to them, he used to dig in the fields all day long. In spite of his hard work, he only just succeeded in keeping the wolf from the door, and the poor little girls often went hungry to bed. One day, when Manzanello was working at the foot of a high mountain, he came upon the mouth of a cave, which was so dark and gloomy that even the sun seemed afraid to enter it. Suddenly, a large green lizard appeared from the inside and stood before Manzanello, who nearly went out of his mind with terror, for the beast was as big as a crocodile and quite as fierce-looking. But the lizard sat down beside him, and in the most friendly manner, and said, "Don't be afraid, my good man. I am not going to hurt you. On the contrary, I am most anxious to help you." When the peasant had heard these words, he knelt before the lizard and said, "Dear lady, for I know not what to call you, I am in your power, but I beg of you to be merciful, for I have 12 wretched little daughters at home who are dependent on me." "That's the very reason why I have come to you," replied the lizard, and said, "Bring me your youngest daughter tomorrow morning. I promise to bring her up as if she were my own child, and to look upon her as the apple of my eye." When Manzanello heard her words, he was very unhappy, because he felt sure, from the lizard's wanting one of his daughters, the youngest and tenderest too, that the poor little girl would only serve as dessert for the terrible creature's supper. At the same time, he said to himself, "If I refuse her request, she will certainly eat me up on the spot. If I give her what she asks, she does indeed take part of myself. But if I refuse, she'll take the whole of me. What am I to do, and how in the world am I to get out of the difficulty?" As he kept muttering to himself, the lizard said, "Make up your mind to do as I tell you at once. I desire to have your youngest daughter, and if you won't comply with my wish, I can only say it will be the worse for you." Seeing that there was nothing else to be done, Manzanello set off for his home and arrived there looking so white and wretched that his wife asked him at once, "What has happened to you, my dear husband? Have you quarreled with anyone, or has the poor donkey fallen down?" "Neither the one nor the other," answered her husband, "but something far worse than either. A terrible lizard has nearly frightened me out of my senses, for she threatened that if I did not give her our youngest daughter, she would make me repent it. My head is going round like a mill wheel, and I don't know what to do. I am indeed between the devil and the deep sea. You know how dearly I love Renzella, and yet if I fail to bring her to the lizard tomorrow morning, I must say farewell to life. Do advise me what to do." When his wife had heard all he had to say, she said to him, "How do you know, my dear husband, that the lizard is really our enemy? May she not be a friend in disguise? And your meeting with her may be the beginning of better things and the end of all our misery. Therefore go and take the child to her, for my heart tells me that you will never repent doing so." Manzanello was much comforted by her words, and next morning, as soon as it was light, he took his little daughter by the hand and led her to the cave. The lizard, who was awaiting the peasant's arrival, came forward to meet him, and taking the girl by the hand, she gave the father a sack full of gold, and said, "Go and marry your other daughters, and give them dowries with this gold, and be of good cheer, for Renzanella will have both father and mother in me. It is a great piece of luck for her that she has fallen into my hands." Massanello, quite overcome with gratitude, thanked the lizard and returned home to his wife. As soon as it was known how rich the peasant had become, suitors for the hands of his daughters were not wanting, and very soon he married them all off, and even then there was enough gold left to keep himself and his wife in comfort and plenty all their days. As soon as the lizard was left alone with Renzolla, she changed the cave into a beautiful palace and led the girl inside. Here she brought her up like a little princess, and the child wanted for nothing. She gave her sumptuous food to eat, beautiful clothes to wear, and 1,000 servants to wait on her. Now, it happened one day that the king of the country was hunting in a wood close to the palace, and was overtaken by the dark. Seeing a light shining in the palace, he sent one of his servants to ask if he could get a night's lodging there. When the page knocked at the door, the lizard changed herself into a beautiful woman and opened it herself. When she heard the king's request, she sent him a message to say that she would be delighted to see him and give him all he wanted. The king, on hearing this kind invitation, instantly betook himself to the palace, where he was received in the most hospitable manner. 100 pages with torches came to meet him. 100 more waited on him at table, and another 100 waved big fans in the air to keep the flies from him. Renzolla herself poured out the wine for him, and so gracefully did she do it that his majesty could not take his eyes off her. When the meal was finished and the table cleared, the king retired to sleep, and Renzolla drew the shoes from his feet, at the same time drawing his heart from his breast. So desperately had he fallen in love with her that he called the fairy to him and asked her for Renzolla's hand in marriage. As the kind fairy had only the girl's welfare at heart, she willingly gave her consent, and not her consent only, but a wedding portion of 7,000 gold guineas. The king, full of delight over his good fortune, prepared to take his departure, accompanied by Renzolla, who never so much as thanked a fairy for all she had done for her. When the fairy saw such a base want of gratitude, she determined to punish the girl, and cursing her, she turned her face into a goat's head. In a moment, Renzolla's pretty mouth stretched out into a snout, with a beard a yard long at the end of it, her cheeks sunk in, and her shining plaits of hair changed into 2 sharp horns. When the king turned round and saw her, he thought he must have taken leave of his senses. He burst into tears and cried out, "Where is the hair that bound me so tightly? Where are the eyes that pierced in my heart? And where are the lips I kissed? Am I to be tied to a goat all my life? No, nothing will induce me to become the laughing stock of my subjects for the sake of a goat-faced girl." When they reached his own country, he shut Renzolla up in a little turret of his palace with a waiting maid, and gave each of them 10 bundles of flax to spin, telling them that their task must be finished by the end of the week. The maid, obedient to the king's commands, set at once to work and combed out the flask, wound it round the spindle, and sat spinning at her wheel so diligently that her work was quite done by Saturday evening. But Renzolla, who had been spoilt and petted in the fairy's house, and was quite unaware of the change that had taken place in her appearance, threw the flax out of the window and said, "What is the king thinking of, that he should give me this work to do? If he wants shirts, he can buy them. It isn't even as if he had picked me out of the gutter, for he ought to remember that I brought him 7,000 golden guineas as my wedding portion, and that I am his wife and not his slave. He must be mad to treat me like this." All the same, when Saturday evening came, and she saw that the waiting maid had finished her task, she took fright lest she should be punished for her idleness. So she hurried off to the palace of the fairy and confided all her woes to her. The fairy embraced her tenderly and gave her a sack full of spun flax, in order that she might show it to the king and let him see what a good worker she was. Renzolla took the sack without one word of thanks and returned to the palace, leaving the kind fairy very indignant over her want of gratitude. When the king saw the flax all spun, he gave Renzolla and the waiting maid each a little dog and told them to look after the animals and train them carefully. The waiting maid brought hers up with the greatest possible care and treated it almost as if it were her son. But Renzolla said, "I don't know what to think. Have I come along among a lot of lunatics? Does the king imagine that I am going to comb and feed a dog with my own hands?" With these words, she opened the window and threw the poor little beast out, and he fell on the ground as dead as stone. When a few months had passed, the king sent a message to say he would like to see how the dogs were getting on. Renzolla, who felt very uncomfortable in her mind at this request, hurried off once more to the fairy. This time she found an old man at the door of the fairy's palace, who said to her, "Who are you and what do you want?" When Renzolla heard his questions, she answered angrily, "Don't you know me, old goatbeard? And how dare you address me in such a way?" "The pot can't call the kettle black," answered the old man. "For it is not I, but you, who have a goat's head. Just wait a moment, you ungrateful wretch, and I will show you to put a past your want of gratitude has brought you." With these words, he hurried away and returned with a mirror, which he held up before Renzolla. At the sight of her ugly, hairy face, the girl nearly fainted with horror, and she broke into loud sobs at seeing her countenance so changed. Then the old man said, "You must remember, Renzolla, that you are a peasant's daughter, that the fairy turned you into a queen, but you are ungrateful and never as much as thanked her for all she had done for you. Therefore she is determined to punish you. But if you wish to lose your long white beard, throw yourself at the fairy's feet and implore her to forgive you. She has a tender heart and will, perhaps, take pity on you." Renzolla, who was really sorry for her conduct, took the old man's advice, and the fairy not only gave her back her former face, but she dressed her in a gold-embroidered dress, presented her with a beautiful carriage, and brought her back accompanied by a host of servants to her husband. When the king saw her looking as beautiful as ever, he fell in love with her once more, and bitterly repented having caused her so much suffering. So Renzolla lived happily ever afterwards, for she loved her husband, honored the fairy, and was grateful to the old man for having told her the truth. That story came by way of Italy. What do you think of that one? And hello, Rudy. So good to see you. Pop up in chat. We're just reading a hodgepodge of stories today. Some fun little ones, some different ones. Just like we're in the midst of hodgepodge of seasons and hodgepodge of holidays. And, yep. Next one. We have comes from the Portuguese. And speaking of spring, what came of picking flowers? Oh dear dear. There was once a woman who had 3 daughters, whom she loved very much. One day, the eldest was walking in a water meadow when she saw a pink flower growing in the stream. She stooped to pick the flower, but her hand had scarcely touched it when she vanished altogether. The next morning, the second sister went out into the meadow to see if she could find any traces of the lost girl, and as a branch of lovely roses lay trailing across her path, she bent down to move it away, and in so doing could not resist plucking one of the roses. In a moment, she too had disappeared. Wondering what could have become of her 2 sisters, the youngest followed in their footsteps and fell a victim to a branch of delicious white jessamine. So the old woman was left without any daughters at all. She wept and wept and wept all day and all night, and went on weeping so long that her son, who had been a little boy when his sisters disappeared, grew up to be a tall youth. Then one night he asked his mother to tell him what was the matter. When he had heard the whole story, he said, "Give me your blessing, mother, and I will go and search the world till I find them." So he set forth, and after he had traveled several miles without any adventures, he came upon 3 big boys fighting in the road. He stopped and inquired what they were fighting about, and one of them answered, "My lord, our father left to us when he died a pair of boots, a key, and a cap. Whoever puts on the boots and wishes himself in any place will find himself there. The key will open every door in the world, and with the cap on your head no one can see you. Now our eldest brother wants to have all 3 things for himself, and we wish to draw lots for them." "Oh, that is easily settled," said the youth. "I will throw this stone as far as I can, and the one who picks it up first shall have the 3 things." So he took the stone and flung it, and while the 3 brothers were running after it, he drew hastily on the boots and said, "Boots, take me to the place where I shall find my eldest sister." The next moment, the young man was standing on a steep mountain before the gates of a strong castle, guarded by bolts and bars and iron chains. The key, which he had not forgotten to put in his pocket, opened the doors one by one, and he walked through a number of halls and corridors till he met a beautiful and richly dressed young lady, who started back in surprise at the sight of him and exclaimed, "Oh, sir, how did you contrive to get in here?" The young man replied that he was her brother, and told her by what means he had been able to pass through the doors. In return, she told him how happy she was, except for one thing, and that was her husband lay under a spell and could never break it till there should be put to death a man who could not die. They walked together for a long time, and then the lady said he had better leave her, as she expected her husband back at any moment, and he might not like him to be there. But the young man assured her she need not be afraid, as he had with him a cap, which would make him invisible. They were still deep in conversation when the door suddenly opened and a bird flew in. But he saw nothing unusual, for at the first noise the youth had put on his cap. The lady jumped up and brought a large golden basin, into which the bird flew, reappearing directly after as a handsome man. Turning to his wife, he cried, "I am sure someone is in the room." She got frightened and declared that she was quite alone, but her husband persisted, and in the end she had to confess the truth. "But if he is really your brother, why did you hide him?" asked he. "I believe you are telling me a lie, and if he comes back I shall kill him." At this the youth took off his cap and came forward. Then the husband saw that he was, indeed, so like his wife that he doubted her word no longer, and embraced his brother-in-law with delight. Drying a feather from his bird's skin, he said, "If you are in danger and cry, 'Come and help me, King of the Birds,' everything will go well with you." The young man thanked him and went away, and after he left the castle, he told the Boots that they must take him to the place where his second sister was living. As before, he found himself at the gates of a huge castle, and within was his second sister, very happy with her husband, who loved her dearly, but longing for the moment he should be set free from the spell that kept him half his life like a fish. When he arrived and had been introduced by his wife to her brother, he welcomed him warmly and gave him a fish scale, saying, "If you are in danger, call me. Come and help me, King of the Fishes, and everything will go well with you." The young man thanked him and took his leave, and when he was outside the gates, he told the Boots to take him to the place where his younger sister lived. The Boots carried him to a dark cavern, with steps of iron leading up to it. Inside she sat, weeping and sobbing, and as she had done nothing else the whole time she had been there, the poor girl had grown very thin. When she saw a man standing before her, she sprang to her feet and exclaimed, "Oh, whoever you are, save me and take me from this horrible place." Then he told her who he was, and how he had seen her sisters, whose happiness was spoilt by the spell under which both their husbands lay. And she, in turn, related her story. She had been carried off in the water meadow by a horrible monster who wanted to make her marry him by force, and had kept her prisoner all these years because she would not submit to his will. Every day he came to beg her to consent to his wishes, and to remind her that there was no hope of her being set free, as he was the most constant man in the world, and besides that, he could never die. At these words, the youth remembered his two enchanted brothers-in-law, and he advised his sister to promise to marry the old man, if he would tell her why he could never die. Suddenly, everything began to tremble, as if it was shaken by a whirlwind, and the old man entered, and flinging himself at the feet of the girl, he said, "Are you still determined never to marry me? If so, you will have to sit there weeping till the end of the world, for I shall always be faithful to my wish to marry you." "Well, I will marry you," she said, "if you will tell me why it is that you can never die." Then the old man burst into peals of laughter. "You are thinking how you would be able to kill me? Well, to do that, you would have to find an iron casket, which lies at the bottom of the sea, and has a white dove inside. Then you have to find the egg which the dove laid, and bring it here, and dash it against my head." And he laughed again in his certainty that no one had ever got down to the bottom of the sea, and that if they did, they would never find the casket, or be able to open it. When he could speak once more, he said, "Now you'll be obliged to marry me, as you know my secret." But she begged so hard that the wedding might be put off for 3 days, that he consented, and went away rejoicing at his victory. When he had disappeared, the brother took off the cap which had kept him invisible all this time, and told his sister not to lose heart, as he hoped in 3 days she should be free. Then he drew on his boots and wished himself at the seashore, and there he was directly. Drawing out the fish scale, he cried, "Come and help me, king of the fishes!" And his brother-in-law swam up and asked what he could do. The young man related the story, and when he had finished, his listener summoned all the fishes to his presence. The last to arrive was a little sardine, who apologized for being so late, but said she had subjects to take the little sardine as a guide. But said she had hurt herself by knocking her head against an iron casket that lay in the bottom of the sea. The king ordered several of the largest and strongest of his subjects to take the little sardine as a guide and bring him the iron casket. They soon returned with the box placed across their backs and laid it down before him. Then the youth produced the key and said, "Key, open that box." And the key opened it, and though they were all crowding round, ready to catch it, the white dove within flew away. It was useless to go after it, and for a moment the young man's heart sank. The next minute, however, he remembered that he still had his feather, and drew it out, crying, "Come to me, king of the birds!" And a rushing noise was heard, and the king of the birds perched on his shoulder and asked what he could do to help him. His brother-in-law told him the whole story, and when he had finished, the king of the birds commanded all his subjects to hasten to his presence. In an instant, the air was dark with birds of all sizes. And at the very last came the white dove, apologizing for being so late by saying that an old friend had arrived at his nest and he'd been obliged to give him some dinner. The king of the birds ordered some of them to show the young man the white dove's nest, and when they reached it, there lay the egg which was to break the spell and set them all free. When it was safely in his pocket, he told the boots to carry him straight to the cavern where his youngest sister sat awaiting him. Now it was already far on into the 3rd day, which the old man had fixed for the wedding. And when the youth reached the cavern with his cap on his head, he found the monster there, urging the girl to keep her word and let the marriage take place at once. At a sign from her brother, she sat down and invited the old monster to lay his head on her lap. He did so with delight, and her brother, standing behind her back, passed her the egg unseen. She took it and dashed it straight at the horrible head, and the monster started, and with a groan that people took for the rumblings of an earthquake, he turned over and died. As the breath went out of his body, the husbands of the 2 eldest daughters resumed their proper shapes, and sending for their mother-in-law, whose sorrow was so unexpectedly turned into joy. They had a great feast, and the youngest sister was rich to the end of her days with the treasures she found in the cave, collected by the monster. See, you don't have to consent to a monster. So that was an interesting story. How about the story of Ben Sardatu? It's an interesting little story. All these stories of love. Love comes in many forms, that's for sure. Spring, love, animals, goat-faced girls, you know. I believe the story comes from the Sicilian storytelling. Did I read that correctly? The story of Ben Sardatu. There was once a king and a queen who had 3 wonderfully beautiful daughters, and their one thought from morning till night was how they could make the girls happy. One day the princesses said to the king, "Dear father, we want so much to have a picnic and eat our dinner in the country." "Very well, dear children, let us have a picnic by all means," answered he, and gave orders that everything should be got ready. When luncheon was prepared, it was put into a cart, and the royal family stepped into a carriage and drove right away into the country. After a few miles, they reached a house and garden belonging to the king, and close by was their favorite place for lunch. The drive had made them very hungry, and they ate with a hearty appetite till almost all the food had disappeared. When they had quite done, they said to their parents, "Now we should like to wander about the garden a little, but when you want to go home, just call to us." And they ran off, laughing down a green glade which led to the garden. But no sooner had they stepped across the fence than a dark cloud came down and covered them, and prevented them seeing whither they were going. Meanwhile, the king and queen sat lazily among the heather, and an hour or 2 slipped away. The sun was dropping towards the horizon, and they began to think it was time to go home. So they called to their daughters and called again, but no one answered them. Frightened at the silence, they searched every corner of the garden, the house, and the neighboring wood, but no trace of the girls was to be found anywhere. The earth seemed to have swallowed them up. The poor parents were in despair. The queen wept all the way home, and for many days after. And the king issued a proclamation that whoever should bring back his lost daughters should have one of them to wife, and should, after his death, reign in his stead. Now, two young generals were at that time living at the court when they heard the king's declaration. They said one to the other, "Let us go in search of them. Perhaps we shall be the lucky persons." And they set out, each mounted on a strong horse, taking with them a change of raiment and some money. But though they inquired at every village they rode through, they could hear nothing of the princesses. And by their money was all spent, and they were forced to sell their horses or give up the search. Even this money only lasted a little while longer, and nothing but their clothes lay between them and starvation. They sold the spare garments that were bound on their saddles and went in the coats they stood up into the inn to beg for some food, as they were really starving. When, however, they had to pay for what they had eaten and drank, they said to the host, "We have no money and food," as they were really starving. "We have no money and naught but the clothes we stand up in. Take these and give us instead some old rags, and let us stay here and serve you." And the innkeeper was content with the bargain, and the generals remained and were his servants. All this time the king and queen remained in their palace, hungering for their children, but not a word was heard of either of them or of the generals who had gone to seek them. Now there was living in the palace a faithful servant of the king's called Bensurdatu, who had served him for many years. And when Bensurdatu saw how grieved the king was, he lifted up his voice and said to him, "Your Majesty, let me go and seek your daughters." "No, no, Bensurdatu," replied the king. "3 daughters have I lost and 2 generals. Shall I lose you also?" But Bensurdatu said again, "Let me go now, your Majesty. Trust me, and I will bring you back your daughters." Then the king gave way, and Bensurdatu set forth and rode on till he came to the inn, where he dismounted and asked for food. It was brought by the 2 generals, whom he knew at once in spite of their miserable clothes, and, much astonished, asked them how in the world they came there. They told him all their adventures, and he sent for the innkeeper and said to him, "Give them back their garments, and I will pay everything that they owe you." And the innkeeper did as he was bid, and when the 2 generals were dressed in their proper clothes, they declared they would join Bensurdatu and with him seek for the king's daughters. The 3 companions rode on for many miles, and at length they came to a wild place, without sign of a human being. It was getting dark, and fearing to be lost on this desolate spot, they pushed on their horses and at last saw a light in the window of a tiny hut. "Who comes there?" asked a voice as they knocked at the door. "Oh, have pity on us and give us a night's shelter," replied Bensurdatu. "We are 3 tired travelers who have lost our way." Then the door was opened by a very old woman, who stood back and beckoned them to enter. "Whence do you come, and whither do you go?" said she. "Ah, good woman, we have a heavy task before us," answered Bensurdatu. "We are bound to carry the king's daughters back to the palace." "Oh, unhappy creatures," cried she, "you know not what you are doing. The king's daughters were covered by a thick cloud, and no one knows where they may now be." "Oh, tell us if you know, my good woman," entreated Bensurdatu, "for with them lies all our happiness." "Even if I were to tell you," answered she, "you could not rescue them. To do that, you would have to go to the very bottom of a deep river, and though certainly you would find the king's daughters there, yet the 2 eldest are guarded by 2 giants, and the youngest is watched by a serpent with 7 heads." The 2 generals who stood by listening were filled with terror at her words and wished to return immediately. But Bensurdatu stood firm and said, "Now we have got so far, we must carry the thing through. Tell us where the river is, so that we may get there as soon as possible." And the old woman told them, and gave them some cheese, wine, and bread, so that they should not set forth starving. And when they had eaten and drunk, they laid themselves down to sleep. The sun had only just risen above the hills next morning before they all woke, and taking leave of the wise woman who had helped them, they rode on till they came to the river. "I am the eldest," said one of the generals, "and it is my right to go down first." So the others fastened a cord round him and gave him a little bell and let him down into the water. But scarcely had the river closed above his head when such dreadful rushing sounds and peals of thunder came crashing round about him that he lost all his courage and rang his bell, if perchance it might be heard amidst all this clamour. Great was his relief, and the rope began slowly to pull him upwards. And the other general plunged in, but he fared no better than the first, and was soon on dry ground again. "Well, you are a brave pair," said Bensurdatu as he tied the rope around his own waist. "Let us see what will happen to me." And when he heard the thunder and clamour round him, he thought to himself, "Oh, make as much noise as you like, it won't hurt me." When his feet touched the bottom, he found himself in a large, brilliantly lighted hall. And in the middle sat the eldest princess, and in front of her lay a huge giant, fast asleep. Directly she saw Bensurdatu, she nodded to him, and asked with her eyes how he had come there. For answer he drew his sword, and was about to cut off the giant's head, when she stopped him quickly and made signs to hide himself, as the giant was just beginning to wake. "I smell the flesh of a man," murmured he, stretching his great arms. "Why, how in the world would any man get down here?" replied she. "You had better go to sleep again." So he turned over and went to sleep. Then the princess signed to Bensurdatu, who drew his sword and cut off the giant's head with such a blow that it flew into the corner. And the heart of the princess leapt within her, and she placed a golden crown on the head of Bensurdatu and called him her deliverer. "Now show me where your sisters are," he said, "that I may free them also." So the princess opened a door and led him into another hall, wherein sat her next sister, guarded by a giant who was fast asleep. When the second princess saw them, she made a sign to them to hide themselves, for the giant was showing symptoms of waking. "I smell man's flesh," murmured he sleepily. "Now how could any man get down here?" asked she. "Go to sleep again." And as soon as he closed his eyes, Bensurdatu stole out from his corner and struck such a blow at his head that it flew far, far away. The princess could not find words to thank Bensurdatu for what he had done, and she too placed in his hand a golden crown. "Now show me where your younger sister is," said he, "that I may free her also." "Ah, that I fear you will never be able to do," sighed they, "for she is in the power of a serpent with 7 heads. "Take me to him," replied Bensurdatu. "It will be a splendid fight." Then the princess opened a door, and Bensurdatu passed through and found himself in a hall that was even larger than the other two. And there stood the youngest sister, chained fast to the wall, and before her was stretched a serpent with 7 heads, horrible to see. As Bensurdatu came forward, it twisted all its 7 heads in his direction, and then made a quick dart to snatch him within its grasp. But Bensurdatu drew his sword and laid about him till the 7 heads were rolling on the floor. Flinging down his sword, he rushed to the princess and broke her chains. She wept for joy and embraced him and took the golden crown from off her head and placed it in his hand. "Now we must go back to the upper world," said Bensurdatu, and led her to the bottom of the river. The other princesses were waiting there, and he tied the rope round the eldest and rung his bell. And the generals above heard and drew her gently up. They then unfastened the cord and threw it back down into the river. And in a few moments the second princess stood beside her sister. So now there were left only Bensurdatu and the youngest princess. "Dear Bensurdatu," said she, "do me a kindness, and let them draw you up before me. I dread the treachery of the generals." "No, no," replied Bensurdatu. "I certainly will not leave you down here. There is nothing to fear from my comrades." "If it is your wish, I will go up then. But first I swear that if you do not follow to marry me, I shall stay single for the rest of my life." Then he bound the rope round her, and the generals drew her up. But instead of lowering the rope again into the river, envy at the courage and success of Bensurdatu so filled the hearts of the two generals that they turned away and left him to perish. And more than that, they threatened the princesses and forced them to promise to tell their parents that it was the two generals who had set them free. "And if they should ask you about Bensurdatu, you must say you have never seen him," they added. And the princesses, fearing for their lives, promised everything, and they rode back to court together. The king and queen were beside themselves with joy when they saw their dear children once more. But when the generals had told their story and the dangers they had run, the king declared that they had gained their reward, and that the two eldest princesses should become their wives. And now, we must see what poor Bensurdatu was doing. He waited patiently a long, long time, but when the rope never came back, he knew he had been right, and that his comrades had betrayed him. "Oh, now I shall never reach the world again," murmured he. But being a brave man, and knowing that moaning his fate would profit him nothing, he rose and began to search through the three halls, where perhaps he might find something to help him. In the last one stood a dish covered with food, which reminded him that he was hungry, and he sat down and ate and drank. Months passed away when, one morning, as he was walking through the halls, he noticed a purse hanging on the wall, which had never been there before. He took it down to examine it and nearly let it fall with surprise when a voice came from the purse, saying, "What commands have you?" "Oh, take me out of this horrible place and up into the world again." And in a moment, he was standing by the river bank with the purse tightly grasped in his hand. "Now let me have the most beautiful ship that was ever built, all manned and ready for sea." And there was the ship, with a flag floating from its mast on which were the words, "King with the 3 crowns." Then Bensurdatu climbed on board and sailed away to the city where the 3 princesses dwelt. And when he reached the harbor, he blew trumpets and beat drums so that everyone ran to the doors and windows. And the king heard too, and saw the beautiful vessel, and said to himself, "That must indeed be a mighty monarch, for he has 3 crowns, while I have only 1. So he hastened to greet the stranger, and invited him to his castle, for, thought he, this will be a fine husband for my youngest daughter. Now the youngest princess had never married, and had turned a deaf ear to all her wooers. Such a long time had passed since Bensurdatu had left the palace that the king never guessed for a moment that the splendidly clad stranger before him was the man whom he had so deeply mourned as dead. "Noble lord," said he, "let Let us feast and make merry, and then, if it seem good to you, do me the honor to take my youngest daughter to wife. And Bensurdatu was glad. And they all sat down to a great feast, and there were great rejoicings. But only the youngest daughter was sad, for her thoughts were with Bensurdatu. After they arose from the table, the king said to her, "Dear child, this mighty lord does you the honor to ask your hand in marriage." "Oh, father," answered she, "spare me, I pray you, for I desire to remain single." Then Bensurdatu turned to her and said, "And if I would, Bensurdatu, would you give the same answer to me?" And as she stood silently gazing at him, he added, "Yes, I am Bensurdatu, and this is my story." The king and queen had their hearts stirred within them at the tale of his adventures, and when he had ended, the king stretched out his hand and said, "Dear Bensurdatu, my youngest daughter shall indeed be your wife, and when I die, my crown shall be yours. As for the men who have betrayed you, they shall leave the country and you shall see them no more." And the wedding feast was ordered, and rejoicings were held for 3 days over the marriage of Bensurdatu and the youngest princess. She knew where her heart lay, and she was not given up, and neither did he. Aww. I've heard kind of variations on that story before, and it's interesting to see, based on the cultures and stuff, where the princess or princesses is taken, how they're taken, and in a way, how they're rescued and who betrays the rescuer. It's kind of interesting. Nothing wrong with similar stories. It's all in the details. Well, I think we are having a good night. And unfortunately, I have a lot of things I need to see to this weekend because there's some change coming to the Creative Corner household in the next 2 weeks. So things are getting interesting. Yes, they are. In good ways. We're going to look at the positive of it. So I'm going to leave you with this. We leave it on a good story and a good ending. Because why can we not choose to leave it on a happy ending? I am perfectly fine with that. So, I'm thankful for you joining me, be it live, be it on video. And you can always join our Discord. Follow the link below. We look forward to seeing you there. And until then, be kind to yourself. Because right now you are the most important person to me, and that means you deserve all the kindness. And sometimes we shortchange ourselves on taking care of ourselves rather than just taking care of everybody else. But once you have that kindness and that abundance of love, for they are very renewable commodities, then you can share them with the world. Freely share your kindness, your love. The world definitely needs more kindness and love in it. So let's just put that out there. Do what we can in our own little corner of the world. Maybe it'll spread. Till then, be safe, be good, stay as safe as you can these days. And if you're unsure about things, just know that I am looking forward to seeing you here very, very soon.